Hello everyone. I've returned from training and have a lot of really interesting stories that I want to share with you. There are so many that I've decided to split them into two parts. This will be the first one. Before each story, I will briefly describe who specifically told it to me. Katie D is a veteran who was an officer in the Mountain Rescue Service for about 15 years. She specializes in high-altitude rescue operations and is rightly considered one of the best in her field. Katie D is a captivating storyteller, and while we were on training, she shared 4 cases from her practice. The first story she told me was in response to my question about the scariest cases. She shook her head and told me that the truly bad stories usually happen on the mountain because the potential for unpleasant incidents is higher there. About 5 years ago, in one of the parks where she worked, there was a series of disappearances. It was a bad year, she said, one of the worst on record, as bad as the weather was. Every couple of days, around 30 centimeters of snow would fall. There were a couple of avalanches that killed several climbers. The team warned people not to stray from the marked trails, but of course there are always those who don't listen. In one particularly unpleasant case, an entire family died because the father, thinking he knew better than the park staff, led the family into an unsafe area. They were on snowshoes, and as Katie D understood, they were walking on snow that looked solid but wasn't. The snow gave way, and the whole family slid almost 90 meters down the slope, landing on rocks below. The parents died instantly. One of the children did too, but the other 2 survived. One had a broken leg and ribs. The other was almost unharmed, except for some bruises and a sprained ankle. The uninjured child left his brother and went to seek help. Katie D said the boy didn't get more than a kilometer before a storm caught him. He stopped, perhaps to try to warm up or just to rest, and eventually froze to death. They found the family with the help of witnesses who had seen them leave the trail, and it was Katie D who found the child who had frozen to death while trying to get help for his injured brother. Katie D described how it had started to snow heavily enough to obscure distant objects, but not enough to make the search impossible. She saw a figure sitting ahead on the snow and hurried to reach it. As she got closer, she realized it was a child, and he was dead, frozen in one of the most sorrowful positions she had ever seen a body in. The child was sitting upright, knees pulled to his chest, arms wrapped around his legs, and his head buried in his jacket. When she pulled back the jacket to look at his face, she saw that he had died crying. His face was contorted, and tears had frozen on his cheeks. She said it was heartbreaking to know that the child was scared when he died. It broke her heart. She repeatedly told me during the story that she hoped the father was burning in hell. Another painful story she told me happened when she was a rookie. Her team received a report about an experienced climber who hadn't returned home the previous day. His wife was convinced something bad had happened because he always came home on time. They went searching for him and had to climb a technically very challenging mountain slope. The rescuers reached a relatively flat area, and Katie D saw blood on the snow. She followed the trail and noticed small pieces of cloth. Katie D wasn't sure which part of the body was bleeding, but the further she went, the more blood there was. She followed the blood and fabric trail to a sheltered spot under a rock and found the climber there. Katie D said she had never seen so much blood. The climber was lying face down, one arm stretched out in front of him as if he had died crawling. Looking around, she saw he was partially disemboweled. That's where the fabric had come from. The guy had an ice axe in a sheath on his hip, and it was covered in blood. Of course, we'll never know exactly what happened, but Katie D said, as far as she could tell, it went something like this. The guy tried to climb to the next area of the slope and used his ice axe to pull himself up. The axe probably hit a loose section, and he fell. On the way down, or perhaps when he landed, the axe pierced his abdomen. The guy dosed himself with painkillers, crawled, losing blood, and eventually died under the rock. Katie D isn't particularly afraid of the sight of blood, but she thinks some of the guys who came to help her carry the body threw up when they turned the corpse over, and most of his intestines fell out. I mentioned that I'd be interested to know if she had encountered any cases of people disappearing without a trace. Her eyes lit up, and she leaned in closer to me. "Do you want to hear a really crazy story?" she asked. When she was just starting out, there was a case that attracted a lot of media attention. A family was picking berries in the woods, very close to the park entrance. They had two little boys, both under 5 years old, and at some point during the day, one of them disappeared. Everyone in the park searched for him, but nothing was found. It was one of those cases where it starts to feel like the child never even came to the park. The search dogs just sat and didn't pick up any scents. No traces of the child were found. The search continued for about 2 months, but was eventually called off. Now fast forward to 6 months later. The family returned to lay flowers at a memorial plaque for their son that had been installed in the park. They brought their other son with them. While the parents were laying out the flowers, they lost sight of the child for about 3 seconds, and in that time, he vanished into thin air. Naturally, the parents were devastated. It's bad enough to lose one child, but to lose two is unimaginable. A massive search operation was launched, one of the largest in the state's history. About 300 volunteers scoured every inch of the park looking for the boy. But again, there was no trace of him. The search continued for about a week, and people were looking for the boy miles from the part of the park where he disappeared. Then, 2 weeks later, a volunteer reported finding the boy almost 25 kilometers from where he had vanished. The rescuers assumed the child was dead, but the volunteer said the boy was not only alive, but unharmed. Katie D and her team went out to retrieve the child, and when they got to the location, she couldn't believe it was the same boy who had gone missing. His clothes were clean, he had no dirt on him anywhere, and he didn't look traumatized. The volunteer said he found the child sitting on a log, playing with a small bundle of old rope. Katie D asked him where he had been and who he had been with for those 2 weeks, and the boy told her he had been with the Blurry Man. Since Katie D firmly believes in the existence of Bigfoot, she excitedly asked the boy what he meant. Was he covered in fur? But the boy said he wasn't hairy. He was blurry, and he described the man as being blurry, like when you close your eyes but not completely. He said the man came out of the trees and took him into the forest. The boy said he slept in a hollow tree, and the blurry man fed him berries. Katie D asked if the man was mean. Did he scare the boy? The child said no, he wasn't scary, but I didn't like that he didn't have eyes. Katie D said they would take the boy to the headquarters, and then a police officer would take him to town and talk to him about what happened. She was friends with the police officer who spoke with the boy, and he told her that the child described how the blurry man kept him in that tree, feeding him when he was hungry. The boy was allowed to wander around a very strange clearing, but when he tried to leave, the blurry man got mad and yelled really loudly, even though he didn't have a mouth. When the child got scared at night, the blurry man made the night brighter and gave him a bundle of sticks. The boy said the blurry man wanted to keep him, but in the end, he had to let him go because the boy wasn't right. The boy couldn't or wouldn't say more about the disappearance. The cops were left scratching their heads. The search for the boy's brother was resumed, but ended with nothing. The boy had no idea where his brother could be, and they never found him. The last story Katie D told me happened to her when she was a rookie and got separated from her training group. They were learning the basics of high-altitude belaying on a well-mapped side of the mountain when she needed to use the bathroom. She walked about 50 meters away from the group during a lunch break and did her business. Here's her story in the first person. I finished my business and immediately started heading back to the group. However, I had only gone about 5 feet when I realized I had no idea where I was. And it wasn't just an, "oh, I'm lost" feeling. I mean, I literally had no idea where I was. If someone had asked me, I don't think I could have told them what state I was in. It was like how I imagine people with amnesia must feel, you know? You're completely lost, and you have no idea what to do. So I stood there for a while, trying to figure out where I was and what to do. But the longer I stood there, the more confused I became, so I decided to start moving. As far as I remember, I just picked a random direction and started walking. And as I walked, it got worse and worse. to the point where I had no idea why I was on the mountain at all. I was just trudging through the snow, and then I started to hear a voice, almost like it was in my head. It was as if a frog could talk, a low and raspy voice, and it kept repeating over and over, it's okay, you just need to find something to eat. Find something to eat and you'll be fine. Just go and find something to eat. Eat, eat. So I started looking for anything I could eat, and I swear to God, I had never felt so hungry in my life. An insatiable hunger, and I think at that point, I would have eaten anything you put in front of me. I had no idea what time it was, so I didn't know how long I'd been gone when I heard a real voice approaching me. I walked toward it and saw one of the rescuers, and he looked damn scared. He ran up to me, asked if I was okay, and what the hell I was doing out there. And the scariest part is, as he ran up to me, I reached for my hunting knife on my belt. I wasn't even thinking about what I was doing, but I was thinking that I needed to eat. If I didn't eat, I would never be okay, so I just needed to eat. He saw me do it and immediately backed off. He shouted at me to drop the knife, that he wouldn't hurt me, and that snapped me back to reality. Suddenly, I knew exactly where I was and put the knife away. I ran to him and asked how long I'd been gone, thinking he would tell me it had been about half an hour. But he said I'd been gone for 2 freaking days. I had crossed 2 peaks and was almost on the other side of the mountain, and if I had kept going, I would have ended up in a 400-kilometer wilderness. They would have never found me. He couldn't believe I hadn't died, and of course, I had no idea what the hell to think. No time seemed to have passed for me. I didn't say anything, just returned to the meeting place with him, and they took me back to headquarters to take me to the hospital. When I got there, they did all sorts of tests and tried to figure out what happened. As far as they could tell, I had some sort of weird amnesia or a strange seizure that knocked my brain out of whack. But the truth is, we never really figured out what happened. It never happened again, but I'll tell you what, since then, I never go out there alone. People give me a hard time for making them come with me when I have to leave the group, but I just tell them it's better to hear me pee than lose me for 2 freaking days on a freezing mountain. The next person I talked to was Ivan Vasiliev, a former coach who now works as a paramedic. He still comes to training sessions like this to help out, but doesn't work full-time with us anymore. He specialized in finding lost children, having a 6th sense when it came to figuring out where they had gone. He's a legend among the veterans, but gets shy if you praise him for his work. One evening he sat next to me at dinner, and we exchanged stories. Most of them were quite ordinary, but when we started talking about our strange cases, I mentioned that I had a buddy who climbed the ladder. He went quiet and asked if I had heard about the little boy who disappeared from the park a few years ago. I didn't, so he told me the story. They were searching for an 11-year-old boy named Joey, who had gone missing near a river. The first thought, of course, was that he had fallen into the river and drowned. But when the rescuers brought out the dogs, they led the officers from the river into a very dense forested area. When we search for people, we divide the area into grids and meticulously search each cell. Ivan's team immediately noticed that the pattern was very strange. The dogs picked up Joey's scent in non-adjacent cells, but lost it when they entered the contiguous ones. If you imagine a chessboard, the dogs picked up Joey's scent in random black squares, but these cells never bordered each other. This, of course, made no sense, because how could the child jump from area to area without leaving a trace in each place he passed through? Ivan and his partner moved into a new grid cell, and Ivan noticed a ladder about 50 meters ahead. He told his partner they should go check near it, but his partner flatly refused. He told Ivan that he had sworn to himself never to go near any ladder he saw in the woods, and that while seeing a ladder in the woods was common, he shouldn't pretend it was normal. He told Ivan that he would wait in sight while Ivan checked the ladder. Ivan said he was irritated, but sympathized with the guy, so he didn't force him to go. I approached the ladder. The steps were small, like on a basement ladder. I didn't have any opinions about ladders, so I wasn't scared and didn't feel any negative emotions at all. I think I'm like most of our rescuers and prefer not to think about them too much. Anyway, I walked up and saw something lying on the bottom step, like someone had curled up there. My heart sank because, of course, you always hope for the best. And we were sure we'd find this kid alive because he'd only been missing for a few hours. But I knew right away that this was the boy and that he was dead. He was curled up on the step, clutching his stomach. It looked like he was in terrible pain when he died, but I didn't see any blood except on his lips and chin. I radioed in that I had found him, and we carried his body back to the operations chief. The poor parents, they were devastated. They couldn't understand how he could have died since he had been missing for such a short time. Plus, we had no obvious cause of death, which only made things worse. I thought he probably ate something poisonous, given that he was holding his stomach when I found him, but I didn't want to speculate. It's hard enough to hear that your child is dead, let alone having some stupid guy from the Mountain Rescue Service guessing what happened. They took his body and I went home and tried not to think about it. I hate finding dead kids. I love this job, but that's one of the reasons I left. I have 2 daughters, and the thought of losing them like that. He choked up a bit at this point. I'm not very good with emotional stuff, and it's always awkward to see a grown man cry, so I didn't know what to do. Eventually, he pulled himself together and continued, "We don't always hear from the coroners about the cause of death. Maybe it's not our concern, and they might suspect something but won't tell us because of some legal mumbo-jumbo. But I have a friend who works in the sheriff's department, and he usually shares interesting information if I ask. But this time, he called me about a week later. He asked if I remembered the kid. I said of course I remembered. He said some strange stuff was going on. He told me, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but the coroner has no idea what happened to this kid. He's never seen anything like it." My friend told me that when the coroner did the autopsy, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The boy's organs looked like Swiss cheese. Quarter-sized holes were punched through almost every organ except the heart and lungs. His intestines, stomach, kidneys, and even one of his testicles were filled with these holes. My friend said the coroner described it as if someone had taken a hole punch and made holes all through the kid's body. That's how neat they were. But there were no scratches, no entry or exit wounds on the kid. The closest case to this happened about a year ago when a guy cleaning his rifle accidentally shot himself full of buckshot. No one had any idea what could have caused it. My friend asked if I had ever heard of anything like this, or maybe if we had similar cases in the past. But I'd never heard of anything like it, and I told him I couldn't help. As far as I know, the coroner listed the cause of death as something like massive internal bleeding, but nobody knows what actually happened. I can't forget that kid. Sometimes I have nightmares about him. I don't let my children go into the woods alone, and when we go together, I never let them out of my sight. I used to love it here, but that case, and a few others, ruined everything. Dinner ended, and we started cleaning up and heading back to our cabins. Before we parted, he put a hand on my shoulder and looked at me very seriously. He told me that bad things happen out here, things that don't care if we have families or what we think and feel. He told me to be careful and left. I never had a chance to talk to him again, but that story stuck with me. By sheer coincidence, I needed to talk to another veteran, Paul Baker, who had worked in the field for many years. We were partners for the training grid sweep, and we just chatted about what we liked about the job, the things we'd seen, and so on. At some point, we passed by some old steps. Most likely, they were remnants of an old fire watch post, given the area we were in. I casually mentioned that I was curious about the stories of the stairs, and regretted that I didn't know much about them. He went quiet, and looked like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, he told me to turn off the radio. Obviously, we're never supposed to do that, but I followed his lead, and he did the same. He told me that about 7 years ago, he was on a call with a rookie. They were in a part of the park where a lot of strange events had been reported. Disappearances, stories of lights in the woods, strange noises, and the like. The rookie was completely spooked, constantly talking about things in the woods. According to Paul, the guy wouldn't stop talking about the goat man. Over and over, goat man this, goat man that. Finally, I told him there was a lot more to be afraid of out here. Stuff that's very real. and he better forget about the goat man. The rookie wanted to know what things I was talking about, and I just told him to shut up and keep moving. We climbed a small ridge, and there, about 10 meters ahead, was a staircase. The rookie stopped dead in his tracks and stared at it. I told him, "See? That's what you should be afraid of." The rookie asked me what the hell it was doing there, and for some reason, I just opened up to him and told him the truth, or at least what I was told was the truth. I could have gotten into a lot of trouble for telling him this, and I might get in trouble for repeating it to you, but you're a good guy, and I want you to stop staring at those steps. The key is to stop in time. So I'll tell you everything I know on the condition that you never tell the supervisors. I promised him I wouldn't say a word, and he double-checked that our radios were off. When I first started working here, we talked a bit more about the stairs and the other things that happen out here. We warned people even before they were hired about the strange stuff going on. I think the Forest Service got tired of the high turnover rate and wanted people to know what they were getting into. So they started making people sign these non-disclosure agreements so they wouldn't go to the media with stories about what they might see. The Forest Service didn't want to scare people away, so the last thing they needed was spooked rookies running to journalists with tales of ghosts and ghostly stares. But eventually, they found that the agreements weren't necessary. People not only didn't want to talk about what they saw, they just didn't bring it up. A few times, the media tried to talk to people when kids or hikers went missing, and nobody said a word. I can't explain it. I think we just don't want to acknowledge it. This is our job, being in the woods every day. We don't need to be scared, and the best way to avoid that is to pretend everything is normal. So I'll tell you everything I can remember, and after that, I won't bring it up again. And I hope you never will either. The stairs have been here as long as the park itself. We have records going back several decades that mention the stairs. Sometimes people climb them and nothing happens. In other cases, listen, I really don't like talking about this, but sometimes very bad things happen. I saw one guy lose an arm when he reached the top step. He reached out to touch a tree branch, and it all happened so fast. 1 second his arm was there, the next it was gone. Clean cut. We never found his arm, and the guy nearly died. Another time, a woman touched the stairs, and a blood vessel in her brain exploded, literally exploded like a water balloon. She sort of stumbled over to me, and all she could say was, "I think something's wrong with me." She dropped like a sack of flour, dead before she hit the ground. I'll never forget how the blood seeped into her eyes. I watched them turn red as she died. I watched it happen, and there was nothing I could do to help. We warned people to stay away, but there's always at least one idiot who ignores the warnings. And even if nothing happens to them, something bad always happens. Kids go missing when we're on their trail. Someone dies the next day, cut in half in a perfectly safe part of the park. I don't know why, but something bad always happens. I don't know exactly why they're here, but it doesn't matter. They're here, and if we were smart, we'd tell our new officers what they're capable of. We both stayed quiet for a while. I was afraid to speak because I wasn't sure if Paul was finished. It seemed like he wanted to say something else. Finally, he spoke again. "Have you ever noticed there are never two alike?" I nodded, waiting for him to continue. But he just remained silent, walking beside me, and eventually he started talking about the biggest deer he had seen in the park. I didn't bring up the topic again, and I didn't ask him to tell me anything more. He left the training the next day. Apparently he left before sunrise, saying he was sick. None of us have heard from him since. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for continuing to show interest, everyone. You've awakened a curiosity in me that I didn't know I had. Thank you all for your continued interest and support. I'll now share the second part of these intriguing stories. The next person I spoke with was a seasoned paramedic named John Evans, who had been with the search and rescue team for over 20 years. John specialized in mountain rescues and had an uncanny ability to find missing persons, particularly children. He was a legend among the team, known for his sharp instincts and calm demeanor in the face of danger. One evening during a quiet dinner, John decided to share some of his most memorable cases with me. John started with a story about a missing child that still haunts him. The search began on a chilly autumn day when the team received a report about a lost 6-year-old girl named Emily. She had been hiking with her parents when she wandered off the trail and vanished. Despite their frantic calls and thorough search, Emily was nowhere to be found. The team, led by John, quickly mobilized and began combing the area. They searched for hours using dogs and thermal imaging, but there was no sign of Emily. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the urgency to find her increased. John's team split into smaller groups to cover more ground, and John himself took a route leading deeper into the forest, following a hunch. Around midnight, John stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin. It was barely visible through the dense trees and overgrown bushes. Something about the cabin felt off, but John's instincts told him to investigate. As he approached, he noticed a faint light flickering inside. Carefully, he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The cabin was musty and filled with old, dusty furniture. In the corner, by the dim light of an old lantern, sat Emily, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. She looked up at John with wide, tear-streaked eyes. John's relief was overwhelming, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was terribly wrong. Emily told John that she had been lured to the cabin by a strange man who promised to help her find her parents. She described the man as tall, with a blurry face and no distinct features, almost like he was constantly out of focus. He had left her in the cabin with a lantern and the teddy bear, telling her to wait for someone to come find her. John quickly radioed for backup and stayed with Emily until the rest of the team arrived. They carefully escorted her back to safety, but the experience left John deeply unsettled. He couldn't shake the image of the blurry-faced man and the nagging question of who or what he might have been. A few days later, John and his team returned to the cabin to investigate further. However, when they arrived, the cabin was gone. There was no trace of it, just an empty clearing where it had once stood. The team was baffled, and despite a thorough search, they couldn't find any evidence that the cabin had ever existed. Emily's parents were overjoyed to have her back, but the mystery of the cabin and the blurry-faced man remained unsolved. John kept this story close to his chest, sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues. The experience left a lasting impact on him, serving as a reminder of the strange and inexplicable events that sometimes occur in the wilderness. Another story John shared was about a rescue operation that took a terrifying turn. It was winter, and a group of hikers had gotten lost in a snowstorm. John's team was dispatched to find them and bring them back safely. The storm was fierce, with howling winds and blinding snow, making the search incredibly challenging. After hours of searching, John's team found the hikers huddled together in a makeshift shelter they had built from branches and snow. They were cold and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. As they began the trek back to base, the storm intensified, and visibility dropped to almost zero. Suddenly, one of the hikers screamed. John turned to see a massive, shadowy figure looming behind them. The figure was almost indistinguishable against the swirling snow, but its presence was undeniable. The team and the hikers quickly moved, trying to put distance between themselves and the ominous figure. John couldn't explain what he saw that night. The figure followed them, always just at the edge of their vision, until they finally reached the safety of the base camp. The hikers were grateful for their rescue, but John and his team were left with an unsettling memory of the shadowy figure that had trailed them through the storm. The last story John shared with me was about a disappearance that remains a mystery to this day. A young couple had gone camping in a remote part of the park. They were experienced hikers and had planned a week-long trip. When they didn't return on the expected date, their families reported them missing, and John's team was called in to search. The team found their campsite undisturbed. Their tent was intact, and their supplies were neatly organized, but there was no sign of the couple. The search continued for weeks, covering a vast area, but they found no trace of the missing hikers. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Months later, a hiker stumbled upon a strange sight deep in the forest. It was a perfectly preserved circle of grass, about 10 feet in diameter, where nothing grew inside the circle. In the center of the circle were the couple's backpacks, placed side by side. The discovery reignited the search, but no further clues were found. The couple remains missing, and the mystery of the circle and their disappearance continues to baffle everyone involved. John finished his stories with a solemn reminder of the dangers and mysteries that lie within the wilderness. He emphasized the importance of being prepared and staying vigilant, no matter how experienced you are. His tales were a stark reminder that nature holds many secrets, and sometimes the answers are beyond our understanding. Thank you all for staying with me through these stories. Your interest and support mean a lot, and I hope these tales have given you a glimpse into the strange and sometimes eerie world of search and rescue. Stay safe out there, and always be prepared for the unexpected.